Hey, I'm gonna show you how to play the Pirc defense. This video will be more like a study guide. You can find a more detailed master PGN in the description down below. So let's get started. The Pirc defense is where white starts with pawn to e4 and now black responds with d6. What are we doing with this move? Well, black gives up the center and refuses to fill it with pawns, but instead builds up slowly with defensive moves such as this one you're seeing right now, and pawn to g6 played in the near future to flank the dark squared bishop. White also often plays pawn to f4 and eventually e5 to add more control to the center. I'm gonna show you all that. So let's say pawn to d4, that's the most common move. Here you go knight to f6. Knight to f6 attacks the pawn on e4. Now, for the sake of beginners, let me just show you why pawn to e5 doesn't work here. If pawn to e5, we just take the pawn, and after pawn takes, we take white's queen and also taking away his right to castle. Not to mention that our knight will now be attacking two pawns and will surely win one here. So that's why you won't see advanced players playing pawn to e5 in this position, and you shouldn't be scared of it. Instead, the move that you're going to see most of the times is knight to c3. Now, I like playing the move knight bd7 in this position, but this will be for another video. The move that I want you guys to be playing is pawn to g6 in an effort to flank your bishop and castle short. So this is the typical position of the Pirc defense, simply the d6 pawn, the knight on f6 and the g6 pawn. Now, right in this position, white can play quite a number of moves. E.g., knight to f3 is called the classical variation, pawn to f4 is called the Austrian attack, bishop g5 is called the Byrne variation. There is also pawn to f3, which is known as the 150 attack, and bishop e3, some kind of a prophylactic move which prepares white to castle long early and may even transpose back into the 150 attack. I will show you. So let's begin with knight to f3 first. The classical variation. Here I just recommend you continue with bishop g7, and from here, listen, bishop c4 is called an open Pirc because it will most likely lead the position to an open one. Any other moves like bishop e2, bishop d3, or even bishop e3 may lead to a closed game. So this is the first secret to keep in mind when you are playing the Pirc defense. Bishop c4 leads to an open position. E.g., after bishop g7 here, if white plays bishop c4, now you can simply castle short. And after we castle short, the second secret is we always want to play bishop g4 before white plays pawn to h3. Bishop g4 is our main plan in the classical variation. The plan is to simply trade off our light squared bishop as early as we can and start replacing our pawns on light squares. Otherwise, if h3 is played by white, then we play the check variation of the Pirc defense. For example, if h3, yeah, knight takes e4 is good, but it allows white to sacrifice his bishop on f7 with check before recapturing our knight on e4, which is why I prefer going pawn to c6 here, which is the check variation. White may castle short, and then we just continue with pawn to b5 right away, attacking white's pieces. Bishop b3, the plan is to take white's pawn on e5. If e5 is played, we first of all take the pawn, d takes e5, b takes c3. I mean, at the end of the day, it's black who is going to be fine in this position. So that was just to show you, in case white plays an early pawn to h3, which they are not going to do most of the times. So right in this position, after bishop c4, an open Pirc, we simply castle short, and instead of pawn to h3, you will see your opponent's castling short most of the times. And this is where I recommend you play bishop g4, trying to get rid of your light squared bishop. If h3, you just simply trade off the bishop, queen takes, and now you can see the whole idea. In the classical variation, here is how we complete the development of our queen side pieces. The knight will go to c6 and the pawn will go to e5. The queen will most of the times be developed to d7. And yeah, knight bd7 is a little bit passive here. At least knight c6 attacks the pawn on d4, which is why you should play it if the pawn on d4 is undefended. So knight to c6, you will see bishop e3, and then you play pawn to e5 right away. So e5 should always be in your mind when playing the Pirc defense. Now here, pawn to d5 is the move that you should always be praying for, because in the Pirc defense, we always want our center to be locked. But if d takes e5, it's not much of a stretch. You can just take the pawn, attacking two of white's pieces. Queen e2, you take the bishop, taking away white's bishop pair. If queen takes c4, well, from here just start playing chess and avoid memorizing moves, e.g. take advantage of the attacks first, like rook e8, putting more pressure on this pawn. If rook a d1, well, be simple and play queen d7. Congrats! You just completed the opening stage in the open Pirc. Just avoid pushing the pawn to c6, as that would just leave your d6 pawn very weak because of white's open d file. So you go pawn to a6, b5, and this rook should be behind your d6 pawn. Alright, let's look at something else. Back to this position, after we play pawn to e5, we just saw what happens if d takes e5, where you take back with your knight and later on win the light squared bishop. But I said if you see pawn to d5, you should always be happy, as we always want our center to be closed. So here, even though we can go knight d4, I suggest knight e7, just playing safe. The idea is to play this in the King's Indian defense style, e.g. if bishop g5, we'll always play knight d7. And you know what? The final destination of our king's knight will most of the times be the c5 square after we play pawn to a5 to stop b4. Not to mention that with this move we want to play pawn to a5 right away. So that's the plan to keep in mind. Let's go back. So after pawn to e5, and then we see d5 once again, then we go knight e7. The move that you are going to see most of the times is queen e2 instead of bishop g5. Queen e2 prepares for bishop f4 pawn push. Here I recommend you just go knight h5, stopping pawn to f4. By the way, if pawn to f4 you have this fork, so that's the importance of playing knight h5 here. There's no memorization of moves. Another plan is to go pawn to f5 and f4 later on. That's why you're going to see some players responding with g4, stopping pawn to f5. But we always want to plant our knight on f4. This is a juicy outpost for our knight, especially if the bishop is not here. But if bishop takes, well, we take back with a pawn. That's a good move. Queen d2 attacking our pawn, well, we just go bishop e5. And if knight e2 over attacking our pawn, we go pawn to g5. The plans are very simple from here. In the near future, we'll play knight g6. Maybe one day we'll put our knight on h4. Not to mention that we have this deadly attack coming. King g7, rook h8, and pawn to h5 to break open the king side. I mean, this will be a very deadly attack for us. Alright. So that was in the classical variation of the Pirc defense. After white plays bishop c4, the so-called open Pirc. And remember right here I said if white plays something else apart from bishop c4, then that would lead the position to be a closed one. Let's look at that also. For example, pawn to e4 we go d6, d4, knight f6 attacking the pawn, and here black plays knight c3 once again. g6, that's our plan. Still looking at the classical variation with knight to f3, bishop g7 planning to castle short, and instead of white playing bishop c4, we see them playing bishop e2. Bishop d3 is also playable, and I'll show you. Well, here we just castle short. This is the simplest. They will castle short as well. Now right here, let me show you the hidden power of our dark squared bishop so that you stop getting scared of pushing pawn to e5. You don't have to memorize this, you just have to know it. So you should always look forward to playing pawn to e5 when the dust settles, because d takes e5 doesn't work, especially if you have already seen this continuation, d takes e5. I mean, as black we have limited options. It's white's game, so we don't mind exchanging queens. Knight takes e5 doesn't count either, cause we have this move, knight takes e4. With this move, now our dark squared bishop directly attacks this knight on e5, which is one thing you should always keep in mind with this bishop. So don't be afraid of pawn to e5, because we always have this trade after knight takes e4, e.g. knight takes e4, bishop takes e4. Queens may be exchanged, we don't care, but we are just having a good game here. So this is just one trick to keep in mind. But let's look at something more advanced. Let's say in this position, after pawn to d4 and then we play knight to f6 instead of knight to c3, which we just looked at. You may also see bishop d3. Well, if bishop d3, I like going pawn to e5 to start controlling the center right away. But for the sake of beginners, let me show you the typical plan of the Pirc. You still go g6. If knight to f3, play bishop g7. castle short, castle short. I mean, the plan is to go bishop g4 again before white plays pawn to h3. Please always keep this in mind after you castle short, okay? We don't want this light squared bishop in our plan. Anyways, rook e1 is what they play. I mean, whenever you have a chance to get rid of the light squared bishop around this stage of the game, do it. h3, you trade it off. Queen takes. Wait a second. Under normal circumstances, would love to play knight bd7 followed by pawn to e5, but because of white's pawn on d4, which is undefended, we instead go knight to c6, attacking this pawn. So c3 will be played. That's when we go pawn to e5. So every move in the opening stage is very important when you're playing the Pirc. d5, our lucky move again, since the center is closed. Well, we just go knight e7, and this is our ideal position in the closed Pirc, just like in the King's Indian defense. If bishop g5 or pawn to c4, we are ready to play knight d7. Let me show you. Pawn to c4, knight d7. Again, you already know the plan. The idea of knight d7 is to put our knight on c5 after we play pawn to f5. Later on, our knight will be very powerful on this square. And we also create a way for pawn to f5. If knight c3, which is playable most of the times, we go pawn to f5. And after queen d1, so we don't want to take, in most cases, we always want to gain some more space on the king side. If pawn to f3, stopping our pawn to f3, we go pawn to g5. This is the Pirc defense at its best. It is now safe to launch a pawn storm on the king side once our center is locked, okay? Once our center is locked and that white's light squared bishop cannot reach us. So these two knights will now go back to the king side, and most importantly, our rook will always sit on f7. I will show you. So after we play pawn to g5, white may play something like b4, and then we go h5. If bishop d2, we go knight g6. You can see how we are shifting all our pieces to this side of the board, because this is where the game is. Bishop e2 by white, we go knight f6. Look at this. Pawn to a4 by white, and now we play rook f7. A very important move. Please guys, listen. This is one of our key moves, rook f7. The king's rook will always be sitting on f7 to guard the whole of this 7th rank. The other reason of playing rook f7 is to allow our dark squared bishop to sit on f8 in order to consistently protect our d6 pawn. So you need to play rook f7 as fast as you can around this stage, especially once you see this queenside pawn storm coming. Well, rook f7, then white just plays pawn to c5, wanting to break open our center. And here is why we play bishop f8, another important move, another key move after rook f7. The bishop on f8 and the rook on f7 are very important because both of these moves indirectly stop any attacks that will come on the queen side, and you will see how. If c takes d6, we take back with a pawn, and rook c1 may come, intending to control this file. Well, we just play rook g7, preparing to damage the king side even further. If knight b5, and now you can clearly see the importance of our rook sitting along the 7th rank, because this knight can never sit on c7, which most white players like doing, by the way. So we go pawn to a6, chasing this knight away, and then we continue with knight to h4. It's just a matter of creating a good plan here once you have this position. If king h1, pawn to g4 is somehow too early, we need more attackers. Queen e8. If f5, the queen should join the party. I mean, we need more attackers before playing g4. And then after rook g1, well, we continue g4, bishop e1, attacking our knight. Hey, be very careful. Just play pawn to g3, and there is this hidden knight maneuver which most of your opponents won't see. For example, after knight a4, maybe white is planning to sit on b6. We now go knight h7. The idea is to go knight g5 next, e.g. knight b6, attacking our rook. First of all, we attend to that problem. Rook c8, rook takes, knight takes, and you can see for yourselves, if not for this bishop and our rook sitting in this rank, we are going to have some problems with this pawn and the pawn on b7. Anyways, knight g5 is the continuation. Knight b6 by white. And if you calculate this very carefully, knight takes h3 is possible. Because if g takes h3, there is a mate coming and most of your opponents are not going to see it. Queen g3 is a very brilliant sacrifice because after bishop takes g3, f takes g3 is checkmate. This pawn is guarded by our knight on h4. So this is just how you can play the closed Pirc, especially if you see pawn to d5. Alright, now let's look at the 150 attack. This will be very short, you guys. E.g. e4, d6, d4, knight to f6, knight c3, all normal moves, then g6. Now wait a second, before we play bishop g7, planning to castle short, whenever you see an early queenside bishop development, for example bishop e3 or an f pawn push or even pawn to g4, just know that our opponent probably wants to castle long and he also wants to be aggressive on this side of the board. So in the 150 attack with pawn to f3, we should stop thinking of castling short, okay? In the 150 attack, I repeat, we should stop thinking of castling short unless otherwise. Our plan will still be pawn to c6 and b5, then queen a5. That's all. At worst, we'll be ready to castle long. So as you can see, we'll only be playing from the queen side, and you may ask, after c6, b5 and queen a5, where are we going to put our queen's knight? I just want you to visualize this. Please remember this. Our knight will most of the times sit on c4. Once our knight is on c4, I can promise you our opponents will be very confused, and I'm sure by that time their king will already be sitting on c1. So that's just a simple plan against any of these moves. E.g. pawn to f3, the 150 attack, we simply go c6. So white plays bishop e3 and then we go pawn to b5. You see what we are doing. Queen d2, that's what they all play. Now you go queen a5. The idea is just to push pawn to b4 and knight a6. You continue with your attack, playing on this side of the board. Yeah, bishop g7 is always necessary. You should always play it, given a move. So g4 may be played here. Now, what did I say? After you run out of moves, you want to develop your knight. Just visualize this maneuver. Knight d7, knight b6, and knight c4. This is where your knight will sit. So we can start this maneuver. Knight bd7. If h4, we don't care. We still go knight b6. h5, we will still play knight c4 attacking the queen as if we don't know what is happening on the king side. If bishop takes, thanks for that move, because now our b file is open for our queen's rook. If h takes g6, we don't care. I mean, there is no serious attack that is coming from this side of the board. This is not where we are going to castle. Rook b8, we attack the b2 pawn. If pawn to g5, we always have knight h5. And if white castles long, well, we can play queen b4 if we want. But even better is to sacrifice our rook on b2. And after something like king takes b2, we give white a check. King c1, we take the poor knight. And now we are threatening to take many things here. Now we come to the Austrian attack. So this is where white begins with e4, then we go d6, d4, knight to f6, knight c3, normal move, pawn to g6. You already know the plan. And now here we see white playing pawn to f4 instead of knight to f3, the classical variation, or pawn to f3, the 150 attack. White plays pawn to f4. This is the Austrian attack. So just like in the 150 defense with pawn to f3, whenever you see the Austrian attack, just know that our opponent probably wants to castle long. So even in this system, we should stop thinking of castling short unless otherwise. Instead, we should start playing on the queen side. We should start playing on the queen side with moves such as the immediate pawn to c5 or even c6. Let me show you. First of all, we play bishop g7 because that's where our dark squared bishop belongs. We know that we are not planning to cast short anyway. So bishop g7, and then if black plays pawn to e5, well, we can simply take this pawn, because if f takes e5, we have this move knight d5, intending to trade our knight and develop as highlighted. If knight takes d5, we have this beautiful continuation where we will actually destroy white's center with pawn to c5. If white doesn't take with his f pawn, let's say if they take with their d pawn instead of f takes e5, we first of all trade the queens and king takes d1 will be played. The knight f d7, Knight d5, king d8, protecting our pawn. If knight f3, we have c6. Knight c3, I mean, anything is playable as long as it is making sense. Here there are no traps, we are just playing normal chess, and this will be good for classical games. Alright, so back to our Pirc defense position. After pawn to f4, the Austrian attack. Stop thinking of castling short, the game will be on the queen side, but first of all play bishop g7, that's okay. And instead of e5, the normal move here is knight to f3. After this, just go c5. Now this looks like a free pawn, but it isn't. Because if white takes, now we can play queen a5 check. The idea is to take this pawn on e4, which is undefended at this time because white's knight is pinned to the king. For example, if c takes d6, we take this free pawn. It doesn't matter what white does. We are going to take his knight. Bishop d2. We take the queen, and after bishop takes, we play knight e3. I mean, it's only black who is better in this position. We have so many wonderful responses from here. So that's not a threat. So just remember this. Instead of pawn to e5, if knight to f3, which is the normal move, you still go pawn to c5. And we saw what happens after d takes c5. It doesn't even matter even if white plays bishop b5 check. Here we just block with our light squared bishop, and after pawn to e5, our knight can always go to g4, that's another square. At worst, it will come back to h6. If h3, we first of all exchange bishops, and after knight takes, yeah, we can play knight h6 if we want, but there's a tactical move here, c takes d4. Now this pawn is controlling the c3 square, so queen a5 check is what we're going to play next, winning the knight in case white takes our free knight here. So queen takes d4 has to be played, and that's when we play knight to c6, attacking the queen first, queen e4, and now knight h6. From here, white should even be very careful here. For example, if white carelessly takes on d6, since our pawn is pinned to the king by his queen, well, we have this move queen a5 check, which would instantly win a piece if bishop d2, for example. Otherwise, this continuation doesn't work either because we are going to win the free rook on a1. Alright, now we look at the Byrne variation, where white begins with e4, then we go d6, d4, knight f6, knight to c3, we go g6. Well, here is where white plays an early bishop to g5. This is my favorite and what I play most of the times in blitz. Well, bishop g5, here you just go bishop g7. And the normal continuation here is queen d2, preparing to castle long and play bishop h6. Against this, you can just go pawn to h6, harassing this bishop. If bishop h4, you castle short, then we'll castle long, and then you immediately start thinking of the queenside pawn storm with c6. You will go pawn to b5, maybe queen h5 before a5. I don't know, but this is just how we play opposite side castled games. But instead of this, there's another tricky line where black plays an early pawn to e5. Let me show you. So back to this position, after we play pawn to g6, and then white plays bishop g5. Well, here I said just go on and fianchetto your bishop. Now instead of queen d2, white may also play pawn to e5, which is the move that I like playing. Because most Pirc players don't know the motive behind pawn to e5. They always take here, which is a long-term positional mistake. After d takes e5, they always take my queen, and after I take back with a rook, instead of playing the correct move, knight d7, they go knight g4, double attacking my undefended pawn on e5. That's what they do. And after I play pawn to h3, they take this pawn with their knight. And this is how I win most of my games, because I just go knight d5 attacking the c7 pawn, and they think knight a6 defends this pawn, but forgetting that I can simply take the knight, and after pawn takes, it is mate in two from here. So this is something you need to avoid when you're playing the Pirc defense. Instead, in the e5 line, what I recommend is as follows. After bishop g5, bishop g7, and pawn to e5, instead of taking, I recommend you just go knight fd7. If they take your pawn, that will be well and good, the game will be simplified, but if they play pawn to f4, just go on and castle short, and always look forward to playing pawn to f6, neutralizing this bishop attack. if knight to f3, you go knight b6, paving way for your light squared bishop and also preparing to go pawn to c6. If bishop e2, play pawn to c6 anyways. Castle short, there is no exact theory here. There are no moves to memorize. Just play anything that is making sense and in a defensive style. For example, bishop f5. If knight h4, you have bishop e6 and pawn to h6 is also coming. So h3 may be played preparing for pawn to g4. Well, you just go pawn to f6, just like I mentioned, harassing this dark squared bishop. If bishop h4, you simply take on e5 with your d pawn, d takes e5, well, you exchange queens, rook a takes d1, and bishop takes c2. I mean, you are just going to have a normal game here. Position is about equal, and this is the end of our study. If you want to study more of the Pirc, you can find the Master PGN in the description down below. So feel free to check that. And if at all you enjoyed watching this video, you know what to do. Give this video a thumbs up. Share this video and let me know in the comment section if at all you loved this presentation and the other suggestions that you have. Alright, thank you for watching this video. Until next time, bye bye.